Harrowfield, Ontario, autumn of 1897. The maple trees had already gone red when they put Nora Shelby out of her own house. She was 31 years old, standing on the porch of the home where she had nursed her husband through 2 winters of illness, cooked his meals, kept his accounts, and buried him in the churchyard behind the mill. She had done all of it without complaint, without wavering, without asking anyone for anything. And when the last shovel of earth was patted down over Edmund Shelby's grave, his brother arrived from Hamilton with a lawyer and a document that declared the house, the land, and everything on it belonged to the family estate. She had been married 6 years and never given Edmund a child. That, the brother said, was the problem. That, the lawyer agreed, was the reason the inheritance could not pass through her. A Barren wife was a wife in name only, and a name didn't hold land in Harrowfield County. Her mother-in-law sat in the parlor and didn't look up when Nora walked past with her trunk. She only said, loud enough to carry, "Some women just aren't made for the purpose." Nora did not answer. She had learned, somewhere in the years of trying and failing to become a mother, that some silences were more dignified than any words she might have thrown back. She left with a trunk, a small coin purse, and a locket containing a photograph of her own mother, dead 10 years. The maple leaves blew across the road in front of her. Nobody watched her go. The town of Collingwood sat at the edge of Georgian Bay, where the lake turned cold in September and stayed that way until May. Nora had no family left in Harrowfield. Her only remaining relation, a cousin named Bessie, had written once from Collingwood, saying she had married a shopkeeper and had 3 rooms above the store. Nora had never visited. She went there now. Bessie was kind in the way of people who are uncomfortable with grief. She offered tea immediately, changed the subject often, and made up the spare bed with good linen. She did not pry. She also, Nora understood within the first week, had no real room for a permanent guest. The 3 rooms above the store were already tight with Bessie, her husband, and a baby who had arrived in July and woke twice each night. Nora found work at the Harbor Inn, washing linens and helping in the kitchen. The pay was modest and the hours were long, but the work kept her hands busy, and busy hands left her mind less room to circle back to everything she had lost. She had been in Collingwood 6 weeks when she first heard the name, Cormac Hale. He came up in conversation at the inn, the way certain men do in small towns. Not because anyone spoke of him warmly, but because he existed at the edge of things, and people weren't quite sure what to make of him. The widower out at Thornbury Road, the one with the 4 children and that piece of land nobody else wanted. He came to town for supplies once a month, paid in full, said nothing unnecessary, and left. The innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Gould, mentioned him one evening while Nora was folding sheets. "Man came in today, Hale, asked if we knew anyone who could help at the house. Temporary, he said, but I don't think he knows what temporary means. His sister-in-law was helping since the spring, but she's gone back to her own family now." Nora kept folding. "What kind of help?" "Children, mostly, 4 of them, youngest not yet 4 years old. He works the land, comes in tired, can't do it all himself." Mrs. Gould shook her head. "Good man, from what I know, quiet, doesn't cause trouble, just had a hard few years." Nora set down the sheet. "Where would I find him?" Mrs. Gould looked at her steadily. "You sure about that?" "No," Nora said, "but I'm asking anyway." She found him the next afternoon at the hardware store on Ontario Street, loading a flatbed wagon with winter supplies. Cormac Hale was tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work rather than age. He was perhaps 40 or a little past it. His coat was mended at the collar. His hat was pulled low against the November wind. He moved slowly and deliberately, like a man who had learned not to waste effort. Nora introduced herself. He turned to look at her without expression. "Mrs. Gould said you needed someone for the house," she said. "I'm looking for work." He studied her for a moment, not in the way men sometimes studied women, as though deciding on a purchase, but the way a person looks at something they need to understand before they commit to it. It's hard work, he said finally. 4 children. Oldest is 12. They're not easy right now. I'm not looking for easy. Another pause. He seemed to be weighing something. Pay's modest. That's fine. You'd have your own room, separate from the house, off the kitchen. Private. When do you need someone to start? Cormac looked at her again. Then he said quietly, Monday. She was there Sunday night. The farmhouse on Thornbury Road was not grand. It sat at the end of a long lane lined with birch trees that had already dropped their leaves, so the lane looked skeletal and pale in the last light of November. The house itself was solid, fieldstone at the base, clapboard above, with a wide porch that had seen better days. A barn stood behind it, dark and large. Smoke rose from the chimney. When Nora climbed down from the wagon, 4 faces appeared at the front window and then disappeared. Cormac carried her trunk to the side door without comment. Children are inside, he said. I'll introduce you in the morning. They're still up, but they don't need to be managed tonight. She nodded. Kitchen's through there. Stove's been going since afternoon. There's bread and cold meat if you're hungry. He turned to leave, she said. Mr. Hale. He looked back. What happened to their mother, if you don't mind me asking? A stillness moved across his face. Not anger, not grief, but the expression of a man who has answered a question so many times that it no longer surprises him. Fever. 3 winters ago. Clara was barely a year old. He paused. Good night, Mrs. Shelby. Nora, she said. He looked at her briefly. Nora, he repeated, and then went inside. She lay awake for a long time that first night, listening to the sounds of a strange house. The particular creak of boards she didn't know yet, the wind off the bay hitting the north side of the stone, the distant sound of a child turning in sleep. She told herself she would stay 3 months, just enough to save something, just enough to find her footing again. Morning brought cold light and 4 pairs of eyes watching her from the kitchen table. The eldest was Owen, tall for 12, angular, with his father's watchful quality, and a set to his jaw that said he had taken on something too heavy too young. He assessed her with open suspicion. Beside him sat Elspeth, who was 9 and said nothing, only tracked Nora's movements around the kitchen with large, careful eyes. The twins, Robbie and Clara, were 7 and 3, respectively. Robbie cheerful in an undirected way, Clara still a baby in her round seriousness, clutching a knitted rabbit to her chest and watching Nora from behind it. Nora made porridge. She put it on the table without ceremony. She asked each child how they liked it, plain or with syrup, and she remembered the answers. Owen said plain and seemed mildly startled that she asked at all. Cormac ate standing near the door, coat already on, ready to go out to the barn. He watched the children briefly, then left without speaking. Nora understood that this was not coldness. This was simply the life he had organized. Keep moving, keep the thing running, and don't look too long at what's missing. The first week was difficult. The house was not dirty exactly, but it had the particular disorder of a place where someone has been doing their best but doesn't have enough hands. The larder was poorly organized. The children's winter clothes needed mending. Robbie's coat had a torn lining. Elspeth's boots were a size too small. The curtains in the main room had been nailed up in haste and hung uneven. There were dishes stacked high enough to make the kitchen feel smaller. Then it was Nora worked without stopping from before dawn until after supper. She did not expect praise. She did not receive it. On the 4th day, she overcooked the potatoes and served them too soft. She set the dish on the table and didn't apologize. Cormac took a forkful. He chewed. He didn't say anything. Robbie wrinkled his nose. These are mushy. They are, Nora said. I'll do better tomorrow. Owen looked up from his plate. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He took another bite. That night, when the children were in bed and Nora was cleaning the stove, she heard Cormac come back in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Robbie didn't mean to be rude, he said. He wasn't. She didn't turn around. He was right. A pause. Children in this house speak plainly. Used to be I worried about that. Don't, she said. I'd rather know. He left without responding. But she heard, just before the door to his study closed, what sounded like the beginning of something that might have been, in another man, a quiet exhale of relief. 3 weeks in, the cold settled down hard and fast, the way it does on Georgian Bay when November makes up its mind. Nora was hanging laundry in the lean-to when Clara appeared at her elbow, rabbit tucked under one arm, and reached up her free hand. Nora looked down. The little girl looked up. She wasn't asking for anything specific. She simply wanted proximity, the way the very young do, before they've learned to explain their need for it. Nora set down the sheet and picked her up. Clara leaned her head against Nora's shoulder with complete confidence, as though she had always intended to be exactly there. Nora stood very still for a moment. Her throat went tight. She had spent 6 years of her marriage being told, in small and large ways, that she was failing at the most fundamental thing a woman could do. The emptiness of it had worn grooves into her, and here was this small person, choosing her with a simplicity that had nothing to do with what she could or couldn't give, only with the fact that she was warm and present. She finished hanging the laundry one-handed, Clara balanced on her hip, neither of them speaking. That evening, when Cormac came in from the fields, he found Clara asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms and Nora reading nearby in the low lamplight. He stood in the doorway a moment before either of them noticed him. When Nora looked up, he nodded once. Just that. She understood. December arrived, and with it a sickness that moved through the house the way winter illness does, quietly, then all at once. Robbie was first, then Elspeth, then Owen, each going pale and feverish within a span of 4 days. Nora moved between rooms with cool cloths and broth and the careful patience of someone who had nursed an invalid for 2 full winters. She kept the fire going. She kept the water boiling. She slept in short stretches, waking to check temperatures, sitting on the edge of each child's bed until they settled again. On the 3rd night, it was Elspeth who was worst. She cried in her sleep and shivered even under 2 quilts. Nora sat beside her and held her hand and sang, very softly, an old Scottish song her own mother had sung to her. She didn't know if Elspeth could hear it. She sang it anyway. Cormac appeared in the doorway around 2 in the morning. "I can take over," he said quietly. "I'm fine," Nora said. "Sleep. You need to be up in 3 hours." He didn't go. He sat down on the chair by the door and stayed there until Elspeth's breathing evened out. And then he stayed some more. They didn't speak. The lamp burned low. At some point before morning, he reached forward and set a cup of tea on the table beside Nora without saying a word, and then leaned back again. By the time the gray light came in, Elspeth's fever had broken. She woke and asked for toast. Cormac left to start the barn work. Nora started the bread. 2 days later she found, on the kitchen table, a small brown paper parcel. Inside was a tin of good tea, the expensive kind, with the tin from a shop in Collingwood. No note. She knew whose hands had placed it there. She stood with it in her palms for a long moment, the tin cool and solid against her fingers. Then she set the kettle on and went about the morning. It was Robbie who named her first, as children do, without announcement or ceremony. He had come looking for his other boot, which had gone missing behind the woodbox, and Nora had found it for him. And as he pulled it on, he said, without looking up, "Thanks, Mum." Elspeth, passing through the kitchen, went still. Robbie seemed to hear what he had said only after it was out. He looked at Nora cautiously. Nora handed him his coat. "Your laces are undone," she said. He tied them. He didn't correct himself. Neither did she. That same evening, Owen came to the kitchen while Nora was rolling pastry. He stood at the table for a long moment in the way of 12-year-old boys who have something to say and are hoping the need to say it will go away if they wait long enough. Finally, "Elspeth's been sleeping better." "I know," Nora said. "Since you started the song." "It's an old song," she said. "My mother used to sing it." Owen looked at the dough under her hands. "Could you teach it to me? In case, for later, her hands stilled on the pastry. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." He nodded and left the kitchen as abruptly as he had arrived. But that night, when she passed his door on her way to check on Clara, she heard him, very quietly, trying out the melody in the dark. She didn't stop. She just listened, standing in the hallway, and felt something in her chest that she had almost forgotten, something that felt like being, at least in part, necessary. The hard thing came in January. Nora had gone into town for supplies on a Tuesday, taking the smaller wagon alone since Cormac had a fence line down in the south field. She moved through the general store on Hurontario, making her way down the list, and she was nearly done when she heard, from 2 aisles over, the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Auld, who had been in the same church circle as Edmund's family back in Harrowfield. "Shelby's widow. I heard she's taken up with a widower out on Thornbury Road. 4 children, no ring on the finger." A lower voice murmuring something Nora couldn't catch. "Hardly. You know she couldn't give her first husband a family. I expect she saw an opportunity. Man in a difficult situation can't afford to be particular." The murmur again. "A sad case is what it is. For the children especially. They deserve better than someone who drifted in." Nora set her basket on the counter. She paid for her items in full. She did not look over at Mrs. Aldhouse. She walked out of the store, put her things in the wagon, and sat on the bench and breathed the cold January air until her hands stopped shaking. Then she drove back to Thornbury Road. She didn't mention it. She put the flour away, started supper, and when Cormac came in at dusk with mud on his boots and an exhausted, set to his shoulders, she asked if the fence had held, and he said mostly, and she put a plate in front of him. And that was that. She had decided, somewhere on that drive home, that she would not give Mrs. Aldhouse or anyone like her the dignity of a reaction. She had learned this lesson slowly, the hard way, over 6 years of whispered assessments about her adequacy. Some words lose their power when you refuse to carry them. But 2 weeks later, in the Collingwood post office, she came face to face with Mrs. Aldhouse directly. The woman looked at her with a particular kind of pity that Nora knew well, the kind that enjoyed itself. "Mrs. Shelby, I did wonder how you were managing." A glance at Nora's hands, bare of rings, bare of anything. "Still out at the Hale property?" "Yes," Nora said. "I do hope you're being careful about appearances." A small, private smile. "Given everything, a woman in your position can't afford to be careless about what people think." "Given everything," Nora repeated evenly. "You mean the fact that I worked and kept house and cared for a sick man for 6 years and was put out of my home for not producing an heir?" Mrs. Aldhouse's smile faltered. "I'd say my position is quite clear," Nora said. "I'm a woman doing necessary work for a family that needs it. If that troubles you, the difficulty is yours." She picked up her parcel from the counter and walked out. She was around the corner before she allowed herself to exhale. That was the afternoon Cormac happened to be in town himself, returning tools to the hardware store. He came around the corner and nearly walked into her. She was standing in the narrow laneway beside the post office, hands wrapped around her parcel, jaw set. He looked at her, she looked at him. "Everything all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "I had an unpleasant conversation. It's over." He studied her a moment. He had a quality of stillness that, she had come to understand over the past 2 months, was not absence of thought, but simply the habit of watching before speaking. "Mrs. Aldhouse," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him, surprised. "She was at the church supper in November," he said. "Said something to my sister-in-law before she left. My sister-in-law mentioned it." He paused. "I should have said something to you sooner. It wouldn't have changed anything." "No," he said. "But you'd have known I heard it, and didn't believe it." He picked up her parcel for her without asking, carried it to the wagon, and set it in the back. Then he stood looking at the gray lake beyond the street. "My wife," he said, "was from Thornbury. People talked about her too when I brought her to Harrowfield, said she was too young, too quiet, too something. There was always a something." He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't pay them much attention." said the opinions of people who don't love you are only opinions. He looked at Nora. She was usually right, he said. And then he untied the horse and handed her the reins and walked back to the hardware store without another word. That night, Nora sat on the porch after the children were in bed. The cold too sharp for prolonged sitting, but she stayed anyway. The stars above Georgian Bay were hard and bright, and very far away, the way stars are in deep winter when there's nothing between you and the sky. She thought about what he had said, not just the words themselves, but the fact that he had said them. This quiet, self-contained man who measured his words like someone who understood their weight. She had come here telling herself 3 months, just enough to find her footing. She was beginning to understand that her footing was already here. She just hadn't named it yet. February brought a cold that cracked the wood on the north porch and froze the pump handle 3 mornings in a row. Cormac was up at 4:30 each day to keep the barn animals through it and came in for breakfast with ice in his beard and a quiet that was different from his ordinary quiet. More worn at the edges, more tired than he usually allowed himself to show. On the 4th morning, Nora had the kitchen fully warm before he came in. She had the coffee ready and a plate of eggs and toast already on the table, and she said nothing at all except sit down before it goes cold. He sat, he ate, he wrapped both hands around the mug and closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and she turned back to the stove to give him the privacy of it. "You don't have to be up that early," he said. "The fire needs tending anyway," she said. "You might as well eat while you're up." He said nothing. Then, "Thank you." 2 words. But from Cormac Hale, she had come to understand, 2 words contained considerable weight. The ice broke in March, slowly and then all at once, as it does on Georgian Bay. Great grinding sheets of it shifting in the gray water, the lake heaving itself back into motion. The children came to life along with the land. Robbie built elaborate snow forts in the last of the drifts along the fence. Clara followed Nora into the garden to poke at the frozen earth and make pronouncements about where things should go. Elspeth asked if they could plant sweet peas along the porch rail. Owen, who had said little to Nora all winter beyond what was necessary, found her one evening working through a torn quilt she was repairing. He sat down across from her. Without speaking, she kept sewing. After a while, he picked up the other end of the quilt and began holding it steady for her, keeping the tension right. They worked like that for an hour, neither of them speaking much. At some point, he said, "My mother's things are in the trunk in the attic." Nora kept her eyes on the needle. "I'm not asking you to do anything about them," he said quickly. I wanted someone to know that they're there. I didn't want everyone to forget." "No one's going to forget," Nora said. He looked at her. "She raised you," Nora said. "You carry her with you. That's not something that goes anywhere." Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad does too. I see it sometimes, when he doesn't know I'm watching." Nora set down the needle. She thought of Cormac at 2 in the morning in Elspeth's doorway, staying in the chair without being asked. She thought of the tin of tea left without a note. She thought of the way he had said she was usually right. Present tense faded into past, and the shadow that moved across his face when he corrected it. "I know," she said. "That kind of love doesn't end. It just has to learn to live alongside other things." Owen looked at the quilt between them. "Like you being here, maybe," Nora said quietly. "If that's all right with you." He didn't answer immediately. He picked up the hem of the quilt and looked at her stitching. "You do good work," he said finally. "The seam's going to hold." She understood this as the answer he was able to give. Spring arrived, and with it a man from the county, a land agent by the name of someone Nora never caught properly, accompanied by a surveyor and a document folder thick as a Bible. They came on a Wednesday morning when the mud was still soft enough to pull boots off and stood on the porch looking uncomfortable. Cormac came out and stood in the doorway. "There's a plan for a rail extension," the agent said, spreading papers across the porch railing. "Runs northeast out of Collingwood. We've had our men out. and your land sits exactly where the grade is most favorable." He named a figure. It was not a small figure. Cormac's eyes went to the bare orchard at the edge of the property. 12 trees his wife had planted the year after they married, bare still but starting to bud. Then to the south field where the fence had held through winter. Then to the vegetable patch along the eastern side of the house, where Clara had helped Nora mark out the rows for beans and potatoes only yesterday morning. "No," he said. The agent blinked. "Mr. Hale, the offer is—" "I heard it. Perhaps you'd like time to consider." "I don't need time." Cormac folded the papers back toward the agent. "You'll find other land. Run your line through it." He opened the door. "Good day." The men looked at each other. The surveyor gathered his things. The agent tried once more. "The company is very committed to this route." And Cormac only said, pleasantly enough, "Then they'll have to get less committed," and closed the door. Nora, who had watched from the kitchen window, went back to slicing bread. When Cormac came in and poured himself coffee, she said, without looking up, "That was a lot of money." "It was," he agreed. "You didn't think about it at all." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara's growing beans out there," he said. "Elspeth's planting sweet peas. Owen spent half a Saturday fixing the fence along the north end because he decided it wasn't going to hold another winter." He drank his coffee. "The money's got nowhere to put a thing like that." Nora set down the bread knife. She thought of a different kind of transaction 6 years ago. A house, a name, an inheritance. All of it reduced to what she had or hadn't been able to produce. She thought of the contrast between that and this man who stood in a doorway and said no to a considerable sum of money because his daughter was growing beans. "No," she agreed softly, "it doesn't." He looked at her. Something passed between them in the kitchen light, brief and quiet, like sunlight moving across water. Then he set his mug down and went out to the barn. Summer came on with its particular Georgian Bay generosity. Warm but not brutal, with lake breezes that kept the evenings bearable, and wildflowers along the fence lines. The children were brown and loud and in constant motion. Clara, who had spent the winter solemn and observant, discovered the pleasure of running without a destination and exercised it frequently, usually toward Nora, who had taken to doing the early garden work and had learned to brace for small incoming weight. One evening in late July, Cormac came out to the garden where Nora was tying up the tomatoes. He stood at the edge of the vegetable patch for a moment and then crouched down beside her without invitation and began staking the next plant along the row. They worked together without speaking for a while. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not sure I'll say it well." She didn't stop working. "Try anyway." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might have decided against it. "Then, when I put the notice out in November, I was looking for someone to hold the house together for a season. Keep the children fed. Keep the place running. I didn't have any expectations beyond that. I know. What you've done here is—" He stopped. Tried again. "It's more than what I asked. What you are to those children. What this place has become, because of you being in it." Nora's hands stilled on the vine. "I'm not saying this to keep you," he said carefully. "If you want to leave come autumn, I won't stop you. You've more than earned whatever you need to start somewhere new. I have a bit set by, and Cormac." He stopped. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He picked up a steak. He turned it over in his hands. "Because I'd rather you knew," he said, "that what you've built here, it matters. You matter. To the children." A pause. "To me." The summer evening held them for a moment, the garden full of green smell and the distant sound of the children on the far side of the house. Nora looked at him. She had spent 6 years being told, in careful and not so careful ways, what she was worth. She had spent 3 years since then learning to believe none of it. And here was this man, not young, not easy, not given to half words or comfortable pleasantries, saying plainly that she mattered. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking because I have nowhere to go," she said. "I'm asking because I want to stay. There's a difference, and I want you to know I understand it." Something in his face, held tight and careful for a very long time, eased. He reached forward and took her hand, just briefly. Her hand still dirty from the garden, his still calloused from the morning's work, and held it for a moment like something he meant. Then they finished staking the tomatoes and went inside to make supper. They married in September at the small Presbyterian church in Thornbury, with the minister and a handful of neighbors, and all 4 children in their best clothes. Owen stood up as witness. Clara held a bunch of goldenrod she had picked from the fence line and gave half of it to Nora without being asked. There was no grand occasion. There was bread and cold meat and apple cake after, at the kitchen table, with the door open to the warm September air. Robbie spilled his cider. Elspeth laughed so hard at something Owen said that she knocked her chair back. Cormac sat at the head of his table and looked, just briefly, like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and had finally let it go. Nora did not have children of her body. She had understood this about herself for a long time, had grieved it in the way of things that cannot be changed, and had set it down. What she had not expected was that there would be a different kind of beginning, that she would sit at a table in a yellow kitchen in October, with 4 children who called her Mum, a man who watched her cross the garden in the morning like watching something he didn't yet have words for, and feel, all the way through, that this was what she had been waiting to grow into all along. The years on Thornbury Road moved the way good years do, through seasons marked by weather and harvest and the unhurried accumulation of small things. Clara grew tall enough to help with the canning. Robbie developed an interest in mechanics and built himself a working clock out of salvaged parts, which Nora kept on the kitchen shelf. Elspeth read every book she could find and eventually went to normal school in Barren and came home in summers smelling of chalk and the city. Owen, who had been 12 and braced against the world when Nora arrived, grew into a steady, careful young man who worked the south field with his father, and occasionally, when he thought nobody was looking, still sang the old Scottish song under his breath while he worked. Nora's garden stretched further each year. She added a long row of sweet peas along the porch, Elspeth's first choice, and kept it every season after. The tomatoes came back reliably. Beans climbed the south fence. Mint grew wild in the corner and resisted all attempts to contain it. There was a fence post along the lane, old and weathered, where she and Cormac had, first autumn of Cleater, that first autumn of being married, nailed up a small board at Clara's suggestion. The little girl had said the farm should have a name like places in her storybooks, and she had considered for 3 days before announcing it. Hale's Rest, Clara had said, because everyone who comes here can stay. Cormac had looked at Nora over the child's head. Nora had found the board and the paint. Cormac had hammered it in. It was still there. Years later, weathered but legible. The letters clear enough that travelers on Thornbury Road could read them as they passed. Long after the rail line was run through someone else's property, long after the children scattered to their own lives and their own addresses, returning at Christmas and harvest with husbands and wives and eventually children of their own. Small, loud, perpetually amazed by the garden. Long after Cormac's hair went silver and the mornings took longer to get through, he still stood on the porch with his coffee and watched Nora move between the rows. She worked the way she always had. Steady, unhurried, thorough. He watched in the particular silence of a man who has more to say than he will ever find words for, and has made his peace with that and shows it the only way he knows how. By watching. When Nora passed, in the early spring of a year, when the ice on Georgian Bay went out late and the crocuses came up before anyone expected them, they buried her in the churchyard at Thornbury. Cormac carved her stone himself, the letters slow and deliberate, the way he did everything. It read, "She came when she was needed and stayed because she chose to. She made everything grow." He visited the grave each morning with his coffee, the way he had watched her cross the garden. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The garden that spring came in wild. Mint out of the corner, And over the path, sweet peas up the porch rail without anyone tending them. Tomatoes from last year's fallen fruit pushing through the cold earth without permission. The children came to help. The grandchildren pulled weeds with the solemn dedication of the very young. The board on the fence post held, "Hale's Rest," it said, in letters weathered and sure. Because everyone who comes here can stay.